As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
In the world that is social media, it can often lead to some, lack of a better word, interesting encounters, some fruitful, some not so much. However, our guest today, I've been fortunate enough to be in several Twitter spaces and in conversation with him. And I'm super excited to be in conversation today on the Malcolm Effect. How are you, Greg?
I'm very well, thank you. How you doing, Mamadou?
I'm well. Thank you for coming on to the Malcolm Effect. You know what? I'm going to be totally honest with our listeners. Today's topic isn't something I know much about, but I know through our conversations, we're just going to unpack it. So this episode will be called A Material Analysis of Space. For those who have been on the journey with me, you will all be aware and familiar with the terms material analysis because I cannot stop speaking about it. However, material analysis of space, Greg, like what are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, so before you and I even got going on how we were going to have this conversation, we were really trying to nail it down. And for me, my fundamental kind of research interest is thinking of the ways that politics produces space, and then also the way that particular way understandings of space kind of inform our politics. And I think also in terms of the material side of it, anybody who has read Marx and indeed a lot of the wider canon of sort of Marxian or leftist kind of political theory and political economy and political philosophy, there are just manifold ways to think about the relationship between space and politics and economy, and that entire kind of world just fascinates me. So when you approached me to kind of do this episode, that was, I just like, let's just have a big long conversation about different ways of thinking about space and politics and Marxism. So here we are today, I suppose.
Let's do that. Okay, so when we say space, then let's pin it down. We're not talking about like the planets or the universe, or what we're talking about when we say space. 'Cause I know people will be confused.
I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I suppose the best way for us to begin would be to go all the way back to Marx. Without kind of relitigating the whole story, Marx really gets us to think about the way that capital is not simply an object. Capital is a social relation, and capitalism is a social relation. And he teaches us about the way that there's a common misconception that sort of capitalism is anything in which somebody has money and spends it and buys something. Whereas what capital is, or what capitalism is it's somebody who has a surplus of value that they are able to put into motion or put into a process without them working themselves. And that's really, really important, because when we then think about the capitalist process, think of a factory, for example. Marx wants us to understand that the factory is capital. The material that goes into the making of the product is capital. The workers are capital. Now, where that becomes spatial is in the factory process, for example. The goods and the labor are put into a process which turns them into a commodity. Now, once the capitalist has that finished commodity, that remains their capital. But in order for them to return to the beginning of the productive process, in order for them to continue expanding their capital by producing more, they need to get that commodity out into the world. They need to sell it and convert that commodity capital back into money capital. And then they can use that money capital to restart the process. Now, so there is an entire sort of spatial, there are so many spatial elements to capitalism, both in terms of like the spatial arrangement of a factory, which concentrates workers and material and productive processes into a space that is then governed by sort of capitalist rules, down to the way that capital moves throughout the world. I think one of the most interesting things to think about this, or one of the ways that we can think about it, is if you think about like the globalization process that has happened since around about the 1970s, big shipping containers. And you can think about, for example, the Ever Given freight ship that was blocking the Suez Canal last year.
Yes.
The container itself, like shipping containers, were a grand like revolution in global shipping, because up until that point, global shipping of commodities had been incredibly chaotic and disorganized. By creating these like uniform containers that could be unloaded off of ships onto trains or onto lorries and then moved around countries and territories very quickly, it revolutionized the speed at which commodities and capital could move around the world. And also, I
Hmm.
mean, related to that as well, if you think about the process of globalization itself, and if we think about, for example, jobs in the global north or in the center being shipped overseas to places in the developing world or the third world like China and Vietnam,
Hmm.
Bangladesh, and places like that, in order for capital to continue to be profitable while shipping those jobs over to these other countries to take advantage of and to take advantage and exploit lower wages, you simultaneously have to streamline and smoothen out the process by which commodities move around the world.
Hmm.
So to finish off, I would simply say that there are two quotes from Marx that I think really kind of get to the heart of what we're talking about. One, which is that he says, like, capital is value in process. And I think that's a
Okay.
really fundamental way to think about it. It's not just money, it's about money in process. And then also, sort of critical geographers and political geographers and Marxist geographers would then sort of take that or develop it a little bit further and say capital is value in motion. And therefore, you
Okay.
immediately have like a spatial conception of what capital is. And the other one to think about is that there's a very famous quote where he talks about this thing called the annihilation of space through time.
Hmm.
So when we talk about, for example, globalization, there is both the movement for capital to control ever more territory and ever more space to expand ever further across the globe. Now,
Yep.
once globalization had accomplished that task, and once we lived in a truly sort of globalized world, once I can sort of get from, for example, London to America in, let's say, 12 hours, then the next task is to reduce that time.
Yes.
You can think about sort of the move, you can think about the move from sort of shipping to air travel. You can think about the development of Concorde. So
Hmm.
that's the other really fascinating element for me, is the relationship between space and time. And that capital both extends and sort of tries to dominate ever greater amounts of spaces, but then it also tries to shrink that space. And in so doing, it also shrinks time. And I think if you think about sort of the chaotic world that we live in today, where everything just feels to be moving faster and faster, and it's
Yes.
very difficult to kind of get a grip on our place in the world, and information and commodities and financial transactions move faster and faster and faster. that, that these are the kind of questions that really fascinate me, the relationship between space and time.
So thank you so much for that. There's several light bulbs going off in my head right now and reflecting on what you just said or thinking through what you just said there. And the first thing I'm kind of called to when Vijay Prashad speaks about it was a massive loss for labor with the introduction of disarticulation of finance or disarticulation of production more specifically, in that, previously it was a person, individual, group of individuals, group of capitalists having to raise the capital in a specific place for the factory and incur all the risk and cost that comes with in order to produce more capital. But he says it was a massive loss for labor with disarticulation of production, because now we have, for example, whereas it was an individual having to, raise a huge amount of sums of money or be gifted that by other means, it was now export to, let's say, Indonesia, for example, where that smaller factory will just be in charge of producing tires, for example, or producing one part of the production process, where and so then they incur the costs, and then how was it a loss for labor? It makes almost unionizing impossible, because places where employees want to unionize, capitalists in America and the global north will just not go to that space anymore. So is that kind of including what you're saying as well? Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's kind of where the more kind of philosophical or metaphysical aspects of space and capital kind of come into question for me. There's a duo of French philosophers from the 1970s called Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and
Hmm.
they're two sort of philosophers that I hold really central to a lot of my thinking. And
Yeah.
they have this concept called like territorialization. And what they use it in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways that a lot of people have picked up on it, it kind of they started off with this, beginning with what Marx would call about like capitalist alienation, in which like the more that capital comes to sort of dominate our lives, the more we begin to understand our social relations and the world in which we live through financial transactions and through the logic of capital, as opposed
Yes.
to human social relations or the material world in which we live. We become more and more alienated from our lives. Now, what Gilles
Yes.
Deleuze and Félix Guattari kind of said to that was, that's not entirely the whole story, because they sort of used elements of psychoanalysis and said, well, if all capital did was alienate you, if it was just that unidirectional motion of alienation from the world, we'd all kind of become neurotics and the world would have no meaning and we wouldn't be able to function. So what they kind of said was, there are two processes. First, there is a deterritorialization, in which like capital kind of rips up our immediate social relations and literally tears them away and sort of disassembles the world around us that makes sense to us. And you can think about gentrification as I talk about this as well. I think gentrification is
Yes.
a really good example of this. So first, there's that motion of deterritorialization, in which all of our social relations become detached and sort of ripped apart by capitalist forces. And then they say there's a simultaneous reterritorialization, in which all of these things are then sort of recoded or overcoded or reterritorialized to the logics of capital. So what they're kind of saying is that, like, no, like, it's not just that you become alienated, it's that actually you get ripped out of your social relations and then you get repositioned in capital and you sort of begin to understand your life through capital. So that's their kind of theory. Now, the reason that relates to what you've just brought up there is that when we think about space and territory as well, it's not just about kind of the immediate sort of geographical territories that I'm thinking about. We can also
Yes.
think about sort of more metaphysical or more sort of conceptual territories. So, for example, back when we lived in kind of, I'd say, sort of the modernist age and sort of industrial age of, say, for example, the 19th century into sort of the first beginnings of the 20th century, probably up until about the Second World War, production and manufacturing and labor, for example, was, for the most part, it was pretty concentrated in single spaces. You know,
Yes.
it's not a coincidence that the post World War II period in like the global North in America and in the United Kingdom was one of the sort of high points of labor, union labor organization, because the state kind of mobilized the entire national productive forces into factories to produce armaments and stuff. People
Yeah.
gave their lives in the war and stuff, and they came out of this war and said, hey, we've made a massive sacrifice, and we're all in the factory together. We all see what we've gone through together. We all see our power. So, it makes sense that the union was strong, and therefore, like, wages were high. You had this massive sort of, very rare in the long sort of arc of history, very rare period of like really strong wages and strong union organization. So what
Yes.
you then get to with the 1960s and 70s and what Prashad calls, the disassembly of labor, or is that capital dismantles that productive process and shifts it into pockets all over the world and disorganizes it, disassembles it. Now, the reason that remains territorial is that there is still a territory at play there. Capital is still constructing its own territory, and it's a territory that actually spans across the globe, and it transcends borders. And it's actually, and this is what I mean again about like the way that the logic of the world kind of becomes re-territorialized to capital. It doesn't make sense that the productive, people, you've probably seen this, stories where like, fruit and veg are picked in one country and then they're wrapped in another country
Yep.
halfway around the globe and then they're reshipped back to the United States. But this is the madness of it, is that according to the logic and the territory in which capital operates, this is the function, because it keeps capital, it keeps labor, it keeps workers separated and sort of, it's madness.
Would you not say it's like a process of circumventing the contradictions of capitalism in the global north, this exploitation of, I mean, as Lenin would say, the highest stage of capitalism being imperialism? Isn't that what we're essentially saying here? That in order for capitalism to continue to have longevity, it had to do that. That was natural, a process or progress in its development to circumvent the contradictions.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I would also then, I think that you and I, as sort of students of global perspectives or people who try to be
Yeah.
attentive to global perspectives, we'd probably ask ourselves the question, has that ever not been the case?
Yes.
And what I would then do is we could probably bring that back to thinking about an individual like Walter Rodney, who,
Exactly.
yes, where, people often ask, what do dialectics mean? And I think one of the
Yeah.
best examples of defining dialectics is when Walter Rodney kind of makes the point that if you've ever heard somebody say, "Oh, well, it was West Africa or the African nations that provided the slaves for the slave trade," well, that supply was connected to a demand, and it was
Exactly.
the demand from the outside that generated the supply from the inside. Those two things were dialectically related. But from that point onwards, and there are plenty theorists who would say that, the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery and that kind of brute extraction of value from enslaved people was kind of the furnace, one of the originary furnaces in which capital and capitalism sort of first took place. But that fundamental kind of dialectical and unbreakable relationship between a capitalist inside and an exploited or oppressed or marginalized outside has been somewhat constant to, even if you don't want to call it capitalism in total, the development of this Western founded, Western driven sort of social system in which we live. And when it comes to the globalized era in which we are living now, in which, aside from a few very small but not insignificant pockets of resistance in spaces around the globe, which I don't want to overlook, I think it's important to remember those things. We do nevertheless live in a world in which, for the most part, to a greater or lesser extent, the entire globe has been territorialized by capital. We are now
Hmm.
living within a globalized inside. You know, somebody like Rosa Luxemburg around about the same time as Lenin would have said that capital needs spaces outside of itself, both to kind of continue extracting, performing primitive accumulation, but also to find new consumers in order to sell its surplus product. And the question sort of becomes whether that is still the case. But what I think we can look at now is that in a globalized sort of capitalist market and system in which everything is kind of inside and it's very difficult to locate an outside, you still do nonetheless require these sort of hierarchies or this structure of differentiation, this structure in which some areas are overdevelopment and gain extra surplus and are allowed to be indulgent and to consume more than they produce, and you need other areas which are sort of quasi outside, in which they produce more than they consume, on which they are primarily exploited. And I think that when you then get to thinking about things like border regimes, and you
Yep.
think about the way that we live in a world in which the neoliberal dream of a borderless world has been realized for capital
Yeah.
and for it's
Exactly.
been realized for capital and commodities. Capital loves a borderless world as far as its own interests go. It isn't as supportive of it in questions of the movement of bodies and the movement of human beings.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think you're right to bring that question up. And I would simply say that, if we look at the long arc of history, it's nothing new, it's nothing novel. What I would say, and I think this is where again you have to kind of be materialist, is to be embedded in the here and now and to really grapple with it. I'm very, we can recognize the tendency, but then it's also about noticing the shifts and the ways that these relations
Exactly.
and again, these spatial arrangements have been altered and adjusted in order to fit the era in which they take place.
Okay, so let's speaking about the here and now, and then you just touched on the in group and the out group. What are the determining factors that go into producing or creating an in group and an out group in the here and now?
That's a really good question. I mean, in the way that I theorize it, and in the way that I have come to understand it, and this is it's so difficult to answer that without getting into a long, long history question. But I mean, you
Feel
have to
free.
kind. Yeah, I know, but I'm worried about your listeners, for God's sake. Um, for me, I think you can. I think it's really important. I'm sorry to do it, but I think you have to go back to the Enlightenment,
Okay.
because the Enlightenment as this kind of philosophical moment, you can think about Descartes, for example, cogito ergo sum. I
Yes,
think,
Sam.
therefore
Yep.
I am. And what Descartes did there was what he did, and again, this is spatial. He established a divide between a subject and an object. He
Yeah.
said, "There is a world and there is a person. And by thinking and observing the world, I can know and I can dominate the world." And it's not an accident that Descartes was also the person who developed Cartesian perspective. And he was actually fundamental to the creation of maps and cartography. And
Mm.
then we can actually get into a big long discussion about how the discipline of geography, the creation of maps itself, the idea of the world as an object to be known and understood, it's very much embedded within those originary sort of European Enlightenment periods, which led to projects such as colonialism and
Yeah.
imperialism. I mean, even if you think about Cartesian maps, the Cartesian perspective, the principle behind the Cartesian perspective was that there was an invisible eye that hovered above the territory that you were looking at. It was an all-seeing eye. It could survey and it could see everything, and it could be in control of it. Going back to your question of like how we develop that inside and outside. I mean, so much of that Enlightenment thinking, whether you're talking about Immanuel Kant or whether you're talking about Descartes, it was founded upon this idea of the European subject as being somebody who had a framework or a system of knowledge, an episteme, so to speak, in which the world was an object that could be known and studied and tracked and conquered and
Mm-hmm.
possessed. There was a relationship between knowledge and possession. You can even think about a word as simple as the word hold, and the way that you can like
Yes.
hold ideas, hold opinions, to hold, to possess. So, you know, you'll often hear a lot of people talk about the Enlightenment and kind of in both positive and negative terms, and a lot of the time it comes back to it. But the fundamental inside and outside was that the idea that the European was the person who had arrived upon that stage of history and possessed the knowledge, and therefore and also within the Enlightenment as well, there was this very linear conception of, you know, development and human evolution, that all of humanity was on this sort of linear trajectory towards the light, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
when they stumbled upon or discovered or choose your verb, people around the world who are at different stages of development or simply in different social relations, different ways of living, different ways of relating to the world, different ways of existing, different ways of understanding nature. They were
Mm-hmm.
seen as being inferior on a lesser stage of development. So I would simply say that to answer that very, very complex question, I think that so much of what we deal with today is a fallout from that sort of fundamental problem. And one other thing that I would also say is that there's something very theological, there's something very
Mm-hmm.
religious to capitalism. There is this idea, a bit like Protestantism, where it kind of says you
Mm-hmm.
have American Protestantism, Calvinism, that if you work hard and if you make money and you succeed, then you are one of the select, you are blessed, then you will get into heaven. And this was very, very fundamental to the American Protestant belief, for example, that if I make money and if I am accumulating capital, then I am therefore pious, which is very
Yes.
important for the moral sustenance of a process like slavery. But
Mm-hmm.
and then the other side of that was that if somebody doesn't make money or if somebody struggles or if they suffer, they are therefore a sinner.
Yeah.
You know. Now, the reason I think that is, I think we still continue to see that in the way that certain people think about the inside and outside today, of who is inside and who counts and who doesn't. You still hear it very regularly when people say, "Why can't Africa save itself? Why can't Africa
I
fix
know.
itself?" So, and again, that takes us back to the Enlightenment again. But how these in groups and out groups are produced. I mean, there's a very famous quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, where she says, you know, capitalism requires inequality. No, yeah, capitalism requires inequality, and race inscribes it.
Wow.
So race is a sort of technology that sort of inscribes upon the flesh, sort of using visual, phenotypical, hematological markers to mark somebody as different, to reflect and reproduce and reify the inequalities and inequities that are produced by capitalism itself.
Yeah.
It's a
So if we're
very these things exist in a constant reciprocal communicative relationship with one another.
a dialectical relationship, absolutely. If we're thinking then about, as you said, that the world has been re-territorialized to the logics of capital and capitalism, just taking it back to the here and now again, or bringing it to the here and now again, what does that look like, manifest, expressed in our political climate today?
That's a really good question. because I think there's a book by a guy called Paolo Gerbaldo that I read just a few weeks ago called The Great Recoil.
Yeah.
And he has a really interesting thesis about this, thinking about sort of the election of Donald Trump in the United States, the success of the Brexit vote in the UK, and the rise of kind of nationalisms and fortress conceptions of the nation state. I mean, even if you look at what, for example, Priti Patel is trying to do with border security and border ring regimes in the UK is another great example. What Gerbaldo kind of says is that since the 1970s, we've lived through a long arc of deterritorialization in which nation states, particularly in the West, have signed away a lot of their political, I wouldn't say sovereignty, but their power to intervene politically within certain debates. Because what neoliberalism was at core, and you and I have spoken about this before, is it was a project in which the question of state intervention in political matters, the idea of, for example, a welfare state, or the idea
Yes.
of, for example, tariffs, or social benefits, or nationalized industry, these were seen as anathema to the functioning of a free market, a truly free market. You know, that liberalism is founded upon the rights of the individual, the right to private property, and the unquestionability of the free market. So when we talk
Yes.
about neoliberalism, this was a group of economics, mostly Austrian, who said, like, no, you have to go back to the source. You have to rediscover those principles, get the state out of the way. So neoliberalism was a process of, it's characterized by, for example, privatization and deregulation of markets, dismantling of the welfare state, globalization, reduction of tariffs, formation of sort of, again, international or transnational territories of trade. So Gabalda calls that like a period of deterritorialization, where basically all these borders and all these sort of spatial and relations were kind of dissolved to facilitate capital. And now I think, anybody who's lived in the world since 2008 can kind of see that capital has run rampant, and we live in a world in which the capital's contradictions kind of amplify and exaggerate and become more and more chaotic every single day. And yet
Yep.
no individual political state seems to be capable of intervening. So then what Gerbaldo says, he uses a Hegelian logic. Some people would question this. I struggle with dialectical thinking on this level. But he kind of says that what we're now living through is a kind of a rebound, a Hegelian kind of antithesis in which deterritorialization is giving way to reterritorialization, in which states are now sort of trying to reassert their national boundaries. And they're based on sort of protection and security and inside outside. So I would say that's one aspect of it. I think that, like, we live in a world in which we're living under both a globalized capital that dominates and kind of directs and sort of is completely uncontrollable across the entire globe, and then also
Yep.
simultaneously we have nation states which are trying to reassert this political question of sovereignty and national identity. Now, let's remember, they still cannot intervene politically in terms of the market. They cannot intervene politically in terms of sort of a lot of those material questions. They can't. Now, that's where you get the resurgence of things such as nationalism and sort of white nationalism, isolationism, nativism, formations of reactionary conceptions of identity. Because if you can't intervene materially in people's lives and alter or redirect the flows of this capitalist system, which, as we can all see, is ripping our worlds apart, if you cannot actually answer that question, and that's one of the things I think is really interesting to note about the right wing, for example, you'll often hear them present quite sort of cogent analyses of the situation, whether it's, for example, a Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom, or over in the US you have figures like Josh Hawley or JD Vance and some of these other, and even Trump. They actually had quite cogent analyses of the situation where they're like, all the jobs have gone away, drugs are ripping through
Yeah.
our communities, no one can get a job, wages have stagnated, the big corporations have taken advantage of you, you can't make any money. The analysis was correct, but what they can't do is tell you why that is,
Yes.
because they are capitalists. And that's why they therefore have to go, it's because immigrants, it's because LGBTQ people, it's because trans people, it's
Yeah.
because the libs, because that's and that's why I think we're also seeing a resurgence or a renewed interest in the left and materialism among a lot of people, particularly young people such as you and me who have lived through this now. Whenever I speak to
Yeah,
anybody a little bit older than me, I'm just like, I mean, I'm 30 this year. In 2008, I turned 18. No, I turned
yeah.
16.
Okay.
I'm getting old. But I just whenever I meet people, I just say to them like, you come at me with these kind of ideological narratives about liberalism and sort of just vote and believe and things will get better and all these other things. And I'm just like, you don't understand that I have lived through this entire thing. My entire adult life has been defined by being kicked in the teeth and kicked in the face by capitalism.
Yes.
And therefore, I think a lot of young people are kind of rediscovering the left because we lived it and we can see it. And to use a vulgar phrase that I learned from Judge Judy, don't piss on my leg and tell me it's raining. So that's one aspect. The other aspect that I also want to think about is I think it's really important to think about that idea of whether you're talking about colonialism, imperialism. Anyone who's read Lenin, where Lenin kind of said once the nation state develops all of its capital within its enclosed space, it eventually kind of gets restless. And in order for capital to keep expanding, you're going to need to go into new territory and you're going to need to perform imperialism. And before World War One, Lenin said, eventually you capitalist national states in Europe are going to go into the third world or whatever you want to call it. And your territories are going to butt up against one another and you're going to break out into a world war. And I think when did he write Imperialism? I think he wrote it in 1905. I could be wrong.
Yeah, look what
But
happened.
he wasn't wrong. Look
Yep.
at what happened. So that's a process of extension. Now, there's another way that you can amplify your capitalist growth. If you can't increase your extension, you can increase your intensity. And that's about
Okay.
using the space that you already have more productively. In terms of the factory, it's about making your workers work longer hours, speeding up the equipment, renewing the equipment, developing the productive forces, replacing sort of analog machinery with digital machinery, replacing computers with algorithms, replacing 20 checkout workers in a supermarket with loads of self-checkouts. And then not only have you then got lots more transactions taking place in a smaller space in the supermarket, you've also got the
And then you got the
consumers themselves
unexpected,
performing the labor.
and then you got the unexpected item in the bloody bagging area as well.
Absolutely. But that's fine for capital because they're not paying anyone to fix that problem. You're just standing around doing.
Exactly.
But so the reason that's important is because intensity. You speed up the process within the space. Now, again, we've lived through a long period of that. But the reason I wanted to bring that up is because I think the other dimension that we are now living through, and it's these things have happened in the past as well. Capital is now creating new territories. It is creating new territories in which it can extend. This was the case, for example, during the 20th century, you had the creation of like radio airwaves. There was a big project in the 1960s in France. All of the radios in France were nationalized. They were run by the state. And Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari and a load of other people were involved in the formation of these kind of pirate radio stations. There was one called Radio Alice. And Deleuze had this big vision of it where he wanted to create these new existential territories in which like the left and sort of these new insurgent forces could rail against capital or live in these existential territories that were outside of capital. And they tragically paved the way for privatized radio. And there's a really sort of poignant quote from Alain Badiou when he talks about this, where he says, but that's the fight. We have to always fight against capital and run the risk that we might be doing its work for it. Now, the reason that's relevant for us today is because there was a very similar dynamic, I think, that is now happening with the internet. The internet is this vast, it is a literally infinite territory. And for the better part of, I'd say, sort of 25 years, as long as I've been alive, the internet has been a relatively open and accessible space, give or take. Your mileage may vary. We can have a discussion about what that really means. But the sort of utopian vision of the internet was that it would be a territory, a space for the free exchange of information, and in which everyone would be able to connect with each other instantly. Think about that space-time compression. I mean, you're in Cairo, I'm in London right now, we're having a
Yeah.
conversation. So again, these spatial dimensions are always there, they're always present. But what we're seeing now is that capital is sort of trying to capitalize and commodify that territory.
Yep.
And it's kicks and spits and spurts. I don't think that NFTs are. I don't think NFTs are going to be the one. I don't think they've quite worked out the technology. I think that it's fraught with. And I'm not an expert on NFTs, so my comment on that is going to be limited. But what you have seen, the way that a lot of people talk about it is they're like, oh, if there's a particular YouTube clip or if there's a particular sound clip or a meme or, you can claim ownership to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, really it's concerning. And I mean, but that's what I mean is that
The enclosure of the internet.
yes, absolutely. And that doesn't, does that mean that these things are going to necessarily become inaccessible to us? I'm not so sure. But what it does, it should tell you something about the imminent nature of capital, that it is
Yes.
constantly seeking to expand and to dominate and to take control of new spaces. And I'm sure that plenty of people will have seen that the latest development in the NFT world is that you can now rent NFTs.
Oh wow.
You don't even get to own them anymore nowadays. That there is the potentiality to rent them. So I would like people to think, for example, about the way that, for example, in the UK, the rent is now, the number of people who are renting is rising and rising and rising. Think about the fact that there have been new developments, for example, where you can rent clothes from Selfridges. This is a fundamental capitalist mechanism, that a capitalist can just simply sit on a product and just let money flow through it, let capital flow through it.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, it's a bit of a tangent, but again, these are the kind of ways that I think about these kind of things. These are capital will create a new territory and then it will gradually extend into it. And
Yes.
that doesn't mean that we can't defeat it. It doesn't mean that it can't be overcome, but it does simply mean that we have to continue struggling against these kind of things while also recognizing that we might be working on the side of it. You never quite know if you're on the inside or on the outside.
Exactly. And we're gonna go back into the inside and outside, but let's speak about a bit how this ties into, let's say, bordering then, or the global project of bordering. How does this tie into it?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that I did a bit of research and writing on for my master's thesis. So I have a lot of different opinions of it, and this is where it gets a little bit more theoretical. But I think there's a common conception of borders that we have, that a border is either simply like the territorial limit of a state. So, for example, I mean the classic kind of symbol in the UK might be the White Cliffs of Dover. That suddenly you step off the cliffs of Dover and you're outside the United Kingdom. Or you might think of just the line that separates the United States from Mexico. And of course, there's been a lot of talk about build the wall and whatever down on the United States-Mexico border. Now, there have been various structures there for decades now, in varying forms, in varying positions. But I like to think, or what I think is more helpful to think, is to think of borders not as concrete structures or objects, but to think of them as an activity, or again, to think of them as a relation. And what I mean by that is that you can build a fence across the southern border of the United States and Mexico, but if there's nobody there watching the border, then someone can cut through it, or they can dig under it, or they can climb over it. In order for a border to operate, in order for a border to become a border, in order for it to become actual, you actually require lots of different activities and processes which make that border real, that make that border work. Processes of securitization, processes of surveillance, processes of violence, processes of differentiation, processes that sort of define or identify what qualifies as inside, what counts, what is allowed in, and what is not allowed in, what is left out. What kind of humans are allowed to pass through into the interiority of the state, and what kind are rejected? Or what I think one of the things I learned when I was studying the US Mexico border was in the 1990s. There's a border strategy called 1994 and Beyond by the US Border Patrol, and it kind of lays out their strategy. And this is at the beginning of the 90s, and one of the things they kind of point out is that they don't really have a lot of like statistical and quantitative data about how many people are actually crossing the desert. And much more than kind of simply stopping people from crossing over the border, one of the big kind of motivations in their project is to gain a better grasp of that. So what happened throughout the sort of 90s and 2000s were there was a serious process of securitizing the US-Mexico border, but not mainly at the main points of entry, at the ports and at the places where cars and motorists, for example, drive through. Now, what this then produced was a sort of what you would call a funneling effect, where all of the people that would previously try and cross the border all across it would now get funneled into a select sort of finite number of particular hot points or hot spots across the border. In many cases, which also happen to be the most dangerous, for example, like the Sonora Desert or the Rio Grande River. And then what they did was they would set up all kinds of sort of very biometric sort of surveillance, electronic surveillance, cameras, motion sensors, and all kinds of things in order to monitor the number of people that are crossing. They even used Native Americans, indigenous Americans, shadow wolves, I think they're called. I might be wrong there. But they would use a traditional practice called cutting sign, where you basically drag a big long object across the sand in order to smooth out and flatten the sand, which is itself a process of territorialization. You're turning the desert and the sand into a tool of the state. So they would drag these objects across to make a smooth patch of sand, and then what they could then do is they could go back after an hour, after 2 hours, and see how many footprints were there. Now, the reason I say all of that is we understand that the United States agricultural system and farming relies heavily upon undocumented migrant labor.
Yep.
And therefore, I have this inkling feeling, it's just sort of a thesis of mine, it's something that I play around in my head, that a lot of the United States border regime isn't actually to stop people from getting in total, so much as gaining a sort of quantitative grasp of how many people are going across and where and at what times and at what seasons. And within that system, even dead bodies become a data point. And I think that's something that I think about a lot. And I think the other thing about border regimes, once you recognize that borders are not about the borders themselves, they are not about the concrete structures, but they are about the activities. They are about these processes that decide who is in and who is out. That's what bordering is. It's about identifying who is a citizen, who is a licit commodity, who is an allowed person, who counts. Once you recognize that that activity can kind of happen independent of whether there's a border there or not, well, then that activity becomes much more mobile. And when I think of, for example, the Standing Rock protests in South Dakota against the oil pipelines that were being driven, put through Lakota territory, indigenous American territory, which, to be clear, these indigenous American territories are unceded sovereign territory of indigenous American people. They are not technically part of the United States. They are technically sovereign. But yet what we see when these people assert sovereignty over their own land against the United States and these sort of extractive capitalist processes is that they suddenly become sort of, while they exist in this liminal space that is both inside and outside of America, once they resist the imperatives and the forces of capital, they become identified as outside or as outsiders. And they are, allowed, or it is permitted for them to be subjected to violent military counterinsurgencies on domestic soil. So that's something I think about a lot. And this is what I mean about spatial and sort of territoriality, the way that politics produces and uses spaces, and the way that the people that exist within a space can become inside or outside at the flick of a button, at the flick of a switch. And you can think about, for example, in the United Kingdom, these attempts by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, to allow herself the imperative to strip somebody of their citizenship without notice. Yep. That's an act of bordering. That is it's a metaphysical act of taking somebody who is inside, who is a citizen of the state, and throwing them outside and pushing them out. And likewise, when somebody dies in a military counterinsurgency at the hands of the state, even though, for example, indigenous Americans are seen as wards of the United States, they are seen as under the protectorate of the United States. If they are deemed to be military counterinsurgent enemies, and they are then killed at the hands of the state, then their deaths are acceptable. And the last way that I would think about that is again, I think about summary police executions, and I think about the executions of black people across the United States, and I think about when any of these individuals are killed, we see that there is this long extended process in the trial and in the media, these attempts to kind of legitimize and render their death acceptable. I mean, for example, with the murder of George Floyd, it was that he used a counterfeit $20 bill, and also these allegations about maybe that he was a drug user or that he was a bad person in one way or another. I view these things not solely, there are so many different ways to discuss and think about these concepts, but I think about a lot of these activities as acts of bordering, these acts of kind of taking these bodies that have these murders, these deaths that have been produced by the state, and these attempts to kind of just push them over the border and to render them outside and to say that they do not count. And as a matter of fact, once the moment George Floyd attempted to purchase something with a counterfeit $20 bill, the moment that he kind of acted in such a way as to disrupt or to subvert or to interfere with the natural flow of the capitalist structure in its totality, that was the point at which he became an outsider. That was the point at which George Floyd became vulnerable to death, as someone like Ruth Wilson Gilmore would say. So I think about that a lot. And then the last point that I would just make on this is that in terms of that inside outside dynamic and how pivotal and how crucial I think it is for us to think about it. When we think, and this is just something that I'm sort of playing with in my head lately and just chewing. And I think it's important for anyone listening to think about it as well. I think a lot about the migrants that are attempting to cross the channel between France and the United Kingdom a lot. And I think about these recent rulings that have said that the United Kingdom, our government can mobilize the navy and the military, the armed forces, to intercept and reject and turn back these boats. Now, what that tells us is that for the purposes of security and military endeavors, and for the purpose of committing violence, these waters are inside. They are the territory of the United Kingdom. But then simultaneously, there have been these things that saying if for example the lifeguard or any individual tries to rescue someone who is drowning, then they can be prosecuted and they can be taken to court. They can be potentially thrown in prison. And also that there are these kind of legalistic structures that they are attempting to put in place which say that the waters are ours, the waters are inside, but the deaths that take place within them as a consequence of our policies are outside.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just something that I don't know. It's just something that I've been sort of sitting with and thinking
No,
about
it's
lately.
fascinating. Fascinating. I'm wary of the time, but I think this has been an extremely generative conversation. I think I'm gonna have
Mamadou, you
to
know me, man. I can go for
I
hours,
have to
ain't I?
have to get you on again. No, it was wicked. But finally, a bit of kind of moving away from our kind of topic at hand today. Just because you're in the UK, you're kind of active in these streets in terms of you have an ear to what's going on. Give us our listeners a quick lowdown of where you think things are politically right now in the UK in like less than 5 minutes.
Oh man, less than 5 minutes. Oh boy. So I mean, what I would want people to think about, and I'm just gonna quickly look up and make sure I get my terminology correct here.
Hmm.
I want people to think about the term counterinsurgency, and I think that
Okay.
we've lived through that. We've lived in a period where I think a lot of us have heard that term bounding around. Now, what counterinsurgency means is that it comes from the Latin, which means like there's a word there insurgere, which means like to rise up, to rise against, and then also if you break down surgere into its composite parts again, there are two parts. There's sub and there's rege. So there's like from below and rege to like to rule or to lead. So insurgency, kind of the etymology means to rise up from below and to rise against and to lead.
Hmm.
And then counterinsurgency, you just got contra, which is just against. And therefore, counterinsurgency, my understanding of it is any movement that is against people rising up from below to lead and rule themselves.
Mm.
So I think about the word counterinsurgency a lot. In terms of where British politics is right now, I think that what, and I am by no means a sort of Corbyn evangelist. People ask me, I go, I'm a communist. Corbyn was a project. It was there for a minute. It was a viable vehicle. It didn't happen. I moved on. But
Yes.
what that period in 2019 was a long-term strategic political counterinsurgency to negate and delegitimize the left in toto across
Mm.
British politics. And I think that what we are dealing with now with Labour is, I mean, is it Julius Nyerere who kind of said, America is a one-party state, but with typical
Fine.
American extravagance, they have two
Yep.
parties?
Yep.
I mean, I think that we're dealing with a reduction of the political question in electoral terms in the United Kingdom to what is effectively a one-party state, and I think that the Labour Party and its operatives are quite conscious of the project that they are engaged in terms of,
Yep.
delegitimizing the left. And I don't think that the question of winning then is kind of secondary, because if it's going to be the rule of capital, and this is what it really means to be living under neoliberalism. As I said, neoliberalism is when you hand over all the political power to the market, and if the market says something's going to happen this way, that's how it's going to happen. So I think there's an understandable malaise and an uncertainty among the left. My position is that I think that the Labour Party is finished, and I think that people on the left would be much better advised to refocus their energies to working, mobilizing, organizing, and strategizing in their immediate local community. I think that if you look at what is happening across the West writ large, let's talk about Hungary, let's talk about France, let's talk about the United States. I think we're in. I think that the forces that are building are really set in motion, and I think it's really important for people on the left to actually grapple with that. And I think you have to actually ask yourself, like, even if you still believe in electoralism as a project, more broadly construed, you really think that voting is going to solve the forces that are coming right now? Let's talk about the line in I think it's in No Country for Old Men. You can't stop what's coming. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of understandable disillusionment, and I think the way that I suppose that I would finish, and to talk about this in spatial terms, and also to kind of introduce some of my political philosophy. There's an Italian philosopher called Marcello Tari who has a book called "There Is No Unhappy Revolution: The Communism of Destitution," and he
Hmm.
talks about this concept called destituent potential. And destituent, he kind of uses it as an antonym to constituent. So people come together and they constitute a power, and then that power is constituted. And what Tari kind of points out about revolutions is that one of the reasons that quote unquote revolutions always kind of fail or falter is that you come together to overthrow constituted power, and in so doing, you become the constituted power.
Yep.
And therefore, so you use violence to overthrow the state, and then you become the state, and then you have to use violence to protect the state.
Yes.
So, and that's not to poo-poo the concept of revolution and revolutionary action. But what I mean is it presents a really interesting question about how do we get out of this bind. So Tari kind of proposes this concept of destituent power or destituent potential, in which the revolutionary action is simply to do away. It is simply to dismantle. It is simply to refuse, to say no, to turn away, to turn one's back. I think about the George Floyd uprisings. Do you remember when they set fire to that police station?
Yep.
Now, I'm not endorsing that action. I'm not saying that we should all go out and set fire to police stations, far from it. But what I do think is really interesting is after that moment happened, there are all these people that came out and went, "Oh no, I don't think that they wanted to abolish the police. I think what they really wanted was they wanted to defund the police. Oh, they didn't want to defund the police. They wanted to retrain the police. Oh, they didn't want to defund the police. They wanted to reallocate
Okay,
resources in order
funds.
to." Yeah, you had all these people all these apparently very, very intelligent and smart people that came along to translate that action and to tell you what it really meant. And I thought that was really fascinating because I thought the truth of that action and the message was, I read it loud and clear. You know, I didn't think it needed much translation at all. So what Tari talks about is he talks about finding political actions and gestures in which both like the analysis of the situation and the proposal and the affirmation, the realization, the sort of the recognition of that message happen in the same gesture. And I think about that just, as I said, not endorsing the action in and of itself, but that was an action that said abolish the police, and it abolished the police. And I think about that a lot. So what I mean to say is Tarry kind of says that we have to find a way to get out of this cycle in which we try to overthrow the powers that be and then we become the powers that be. And I think that there is an element of that in the way that electoralism and electoral politics has become the only way that we can conceive of political change. And the way I would finish this is there's a lot of talk about the Matrix right now, and understandably so, because obviously that the newest version has just come out. And to be clear, I've only ever seen the first one. But a lot of people talk about the Matrix as a metaphor for kind of revolution or overthrowing capitalism or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's the best metaphor that we have, because the problem with the Matrix is that from the very first instant almost, Neo is already outside. Do you know what I mean? He's taken out of that structure, and he's immediately presented with the space from which to attack.
Yeah.
And we don't have that. We're still all very much inside. And we are trying to find a positionality or a place or a space from which to resist an attack. And we're never quite sure if we're outside again. Remember that what Badiou said about Deleuze and the radio station. You never know if you're inside capital or outside. And I think we really have to ask ourselves that question. So the metaphor that I've been sort of talking about with a few people lately is Jim Carrey in The Truman Show.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people should go back and rewatch that film. Maybe partly because it's one of the few good films that Jim Carrey has been in. But I drew a downward spiral. But no,
come on, The Mask, man. Jim Carrey is a goat. But anyway,
that's true. Somebody stop me. But still, no, you're absolutely right. To be fair, and Cameron Diaz as well. Whew. Anyway,
exactly.
the point is that Jim Carrey, at some point in that film, he realizes that he is existing within a territory that can present him with no truth. And he spends a lot of that film within that interiority, searching for a truth. But of course, we as the audience know that any truth or fact or revelation that he achieves within that space is going to necessarily be hollow, because it is already determined by the force above him. He's still inside. You see that with his wife and with the people around him, and he discovers the bits of the set. There are these partial truths, but he's never fully outside. And the important metaphor of that film is that he finally realizes what he needs to do. And he gets in that boat, and he rides in that boat through rocky waves and rocky waters all the way to the very edge. And he gets to that door, and he opens up that door onto a black abyss. And he turns around and he says, "And in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night." And what I think is the political valence of that is the point at which he is at the black door, beyond which he does not know what lies. That is the point at which the truly political question can begin. When you have finally found a way or discovered the imperative to step outside. And that is where politics begins. And I think that a lot of us need to think about how we're going to find that outside. Sorry, my cat
on
is
that,
scratching.
absolutely fine. On that sick note, I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Honestly, it's been a pleasure.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to post Gregg's socials in the comments of the episodes. Again, as always, please like, comment, subscribe. The Malcolm Effect on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Until then, peace out.